December 1972, against the backdrop of a Vietnam War that had dragged on for nearly 2 decades, and the Paris peace talks falling into deadlock, the U.S. administration decided to launch the strategic bombing campaign Linebacker II, the largest aerial assault of the entire war. On the Vietnamese side, this campaign was given names laden with profound historical significance. The 12 Days and Nights, or Dien Bien Phu in the air, reflecting its decisive nature and unprecedented level of ferocity. Over 12 consecutive days and nights, from December 18th to December 29th, 1972, the U.S. Air Force mobilized an enormous force, deploying more than 200 B-52 strategic bombers, along with hundreds of tactical aircraft, reconnaissance planes, electronic warfare aircraft, and aerial refueling tankers. In total, the United States carried out approximately 730 sorties, dropping over 20,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam, primarily targeting Hanoi, Haiphong, and key transportation and military facilities. The core objective of Linebacker II was not purely military, but carried a clear political and strategic intent. President Richard Nixon's administration and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger believed that a devastating shock delivered by overwhelming air power would paralyze Vietnam's will to resist, thereby forcing Hanoi to make concessions and accept terms favorable to the United States at the Paris negotiating table. In their calculations, the B-52, symbolizing the ultimate power of U.S. Air Force, was considered an invulnerable weapon capable of determining the outcome of the war within a short time. It was precisely this absolute confidence that led U.S. leaders to stake their entire strategic gamble on Linebacker II, ushering in a historic confrontation in the skies over Hanoi at the end of 1972. From the very first days of the campaign, however, the scale of destruction and losses far exceeded initial U.S. expectations, leaving severe consequences for both sides. For Vietnam, massive B-52 bombing raids caused heavy human and material losses, particularly in the capital city of Hanoi, which became the campaign's primary target. According to published figures, approximately 1,600 Vietnamese civilians were killed, thousands more were wounded, and numerous residential areas, hospitals, schools, and infrastructure facilities were severely damaged. Hanoi endured nights of bombardment more intense than at any previous point in the war, leaving deep scars on social life and collective memory. Yet, what most shocked U.S. military and political circles was the heavy loss suffered by the U.S. Air Force itself. In a short period, 15 B-52 strategic bombers were shot down, with some days seeing as many as 6 aircraft lost, an unprecedented figure in the operational history of these flying fortresses. In addition, 33 U.S. pilots were killed, and many others were captured as prisoners of war. These losses not only inflicted significant material damage, but also dealt a severe blow to American confidence in the doctrine of absolute superiority of strategic air power. In the recollections of many U.S. pilots who participated in the campaign, flying into Hanoi's airspace was described as walking into a missile's mouth. They faced an extraordinarily dense air defense network, where SAM missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and radar systems operated in an integrated manner. The night sky over Hanoi was illuminated by crisscrossing trails of anti-aircraft fire and missiles, so bright that many pilots recalled feeling as if they were flying in daylight. These harrowing experiences became lasting nightmares for many U.S. pilots long after the war. Even decades later, memories of flying into the fire cauldron of Hanoi continue to be recalled as among the most brutal and terrifying trials of their military careers. Behind the Linebacker II bombing campaign lay not only military objectives, but more importantly, high-level political motives of the U.S. administration, led by President Richard Nixon. After his re-election in late 1972, Nixon faced immense pressure to quickly end the Vietnam War, a conflict that had deeply divided American society, eroded government credibility, and drained vast resources. His goal was not an outright public defeat, but rather to end the war under what he termed peace with honor, sufficient to preserve America's image and international standing as he entered a new term. In this context, the Paris peace talks reached an impasse. Key issues concerning U.S. troop withdrawal, the role of the Saigon government, and the political future of South Vietnam failed to achieve consensus. Fearing the collapse of negotiations and concerned that Vietnam would reject Washington's demands, Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger chose the option of extreme military force. The B-52, emblem of U.S. air power supremacy, was assigned the role of direct coercive instrument, with the expectation that devastating bombardment would force Hanoi to retreat at the negotiating table. However, battlefield reality ran completely counter to U.S. calculations. Despite suffering heavy losses in infrastructure and human life, Vietnam did not alter its core positions at the Paris talks. On the contrary, people was further strengthened, while successes in shooting down B-52s generated significant political and psychological advantages for Vietnam. Conversely, Linebacker 2 triggered an unprecedented wave of opposition within U.S. and international public opinion. Images of residential areas, hospitals, and schools destroyed by B-52 bombs provoked widespread outrage. In the United States, the anti-war movement resurged on a large scale, with Congress and the media exerting continuous pressure on the administration to halt the bombing. Internationally, many countries and organizations strongly condemned U.S. military actions, viewing them as a brutal and inhumane escalation. Thus, rather than delivering a decisive political blow, Linebacker 2 exposed a grave strategic miscalculation: the belief that sheer military power could subdue the will of a nation fighting for independence and reunification. One decisive factor giving historical depth and strategic significance to the victory known as Dien Bien Phu in the air was the exceptionally far-sighted strategic vision of President Ho Chi Minh. As early as 1968, when the Vietnam War was still raging and the U.S. Air Force had not yet used B-52s to directly bomb Hanoi, President Ho issued a long-term strategic prediction. Open quote, "Sooner or later, the U.S. imperialists will bring B-52s to bomb Hanoi, and only then will they accept defeat." Close quote. This was not a subjective guess, but stemmed from his profound understanding of U.S. aggressive warfare patterns and international historical experience. He observed that before signing the armistice in Korea, the U.S. had devastated Pyongyang with air power. Therefore, in Vietnam, the U.S. would only de-escalate after playing its final card, the B-52 strategic bomber. According to him, America's decisive defeat, if it occurred, would not be on the ground, but in the skies over Hanoi, the political, military, and spiritual center of North Vietnam. This strategic forecast became a crucial guiding principle for the long-term preparations of Vietnam's Air Defense Air Force. For many years prior to 1972, Vietnam quietly built a multi-layered air defense system and studied ways to combat the B-52, an aircraft the U.S. and much of the world then regarded as invincible. In reality, before Linebacker 2, Vietnamese missile units had already shot down B-52s on 3 separate occasions in different theaters, from Vinh Linh and Route 9 southern Laos to Quang Tri. These victories clearly demonstrated that the B-52 was not invulnerable. However, the U.S. did not dare to publicly acknowledge these losses, fearing damage to the image of the Flying Fortress, symbol of absolute air power dominance. Admitting B-52 losses would have meant admitting that U.S. air power doctrine could be broken, with serious psychological, political, and military consequences. When Linebacker 2 erupted at the end of 1972, President Ho Chi Minh's prediction became historical reality. The U.S. only ceased bombing and returned to the negotiating table after suffering heavy B-52 losses over Hanoi. This not only affirmed his visionary genius, but also validated the correctness of Vietnam's strategic preparation: persistent, proactive, and resolute in confronting a vastly stronger adversary. The victory in the 12-day and night showdown of late 1972 was not accidental, but the result of comprehensive, long-term, and deeply strategic preparation by Vietnam, military, political, and psychological. Above all, it reflected the indomitable will and resilience of a nation ready to face existential trials to defend its independence and sovereignty. First and foremost was the direct role of party and state leadership during the most critical days. Contrary to some later assumptions, throughout the campaign, top leaders of the party, state, and government remained in Hanoi, directly commanding, encouraging, and standing alongside the people under bombardment. The Ministry of National Defense headquarters was not evacuated but remained within the Hanoi citadel. This ensured uninterrupted command while serving as a powerful morale booster, embodying the resolve that, as long as Hanoi stands, everything stands. Alongside political and moral steadfastness, Vietnam built a tight, scientific, and flexible air defense, Air Force posture rarely seen in modern warfare. Multi-layered radar networks enabled early detection of distant raids. Surface-to-air missile forces, especially SAM-2 units, were organized into an integrated network, closely coordinated with low and medium-altitude anti-aircraft artillery and fighter aircraft. Each force had a specific role, yet functioned as part of a unified whole, forming a dense, air defense fire net over Hanoi and other key areas. The Vietnamese military continuously drew lessons from combat experience, studied B-52 operational patterns, and analyzed U.S. electronic jamming techniques. Tactics were flexibly adjusted to maintain secrecy while enhancing interception effectiveness. This combination of human intellect and technical means, fighting spirit and military science, created an effective capability against one of America's most advanced weapons. Civilian protection was also prioritized. Before and during the early days of the campaign, over 300,000 people were evacuated from key target areas, particularly Hanoi and surrounding regions. Shelter systems, air raid warnings, and local militia forces were mobilized in coordination, significantly reducing civilian casualties under the devastating power of B-52 bombs. This comprehensive preparation, from leadership and command to force organization and civilian protection, formed the solid foundation enabling Vietnam to enter the historic showdown, ready to defeat the flying fortress over the capital's skies. Major battle developments. 29 December 1972. The historic confrontation between Vietnam's Air Defense Air Force and U.S. strategic air power officially began on the night of December 18, 1972, marking the start of 12 unprecedentedly fierce days and nights over Hanoi and North Vietnam. Night of December 18th, opening strike. On the evening of December 18th, the U.S. unexpectedly launched 129 aircraft, including 87 B-52 strategic bombers, accompanied by dozens of fighters, jamming, reconnaissance, and refueling aircraft. This massive opening blow aimed to quickly overwhelm and shock Vietnam's air defenses. Contrary to Washington's calculations, however, Vietnamese air defense forces shot down 3 B-52s on the very first night, some crashing on the spot. This achievement was of extraordinary significance. For the first time, the myth of the invincible B-52 was shattered over Hanoi, delivering a major shock to U.S. air power and powerfully boosting Vietnamese morale. Nights of December 19 to 20, tactical turning point. After the opening night, instead of fundamentally changing tactics, the U.S. continued bombing using familiar flight formations, stable altitudes, and electronic countermeasures considered safe. This overconfidence allowed Vietnam to quickly draw lessons and refine B-52 interception tactics. Radar, missile, and anti-aircraft units coordinated more closely, accurately determining enemy flight paths, altitudes, and speeds, thereby improving interception effectiveness. As a result, during the nights of December 19th and 20th, additional B-52s were shot down, inflicting increasing losses on U.S. air power. Notably, a B-52 crashed on the spot in the Phu Lo area, Dong An, providing irrefutable evidence of the flying fortress's defeat. These losses not only reduced U.S. combat capability, but also deeply affected pilot morale and strategic command confidence. Night of December 26, the decisive battle. After a temporary Christmas bombing pause to adjust tactics, the U.S. concentrated its full force on what it considered the campaign's decisive engagement. On the night of December 26, 1972, U.S. Air Forces deployed up to 120 B-52s, the largest single concentration in the entire Vietnam War, for an unprecedented bombardment of Hanoi and surrounding areas. Washington hoped this overwhelming power would completely crush Vietnam's air defenses. Instead, the opposite occurred. With meticulous preparation, accumulated experience, and peak combat spirit, Vietnam's Air Defense Air Force mounted an extraordinarily effective counterattack. In a single night, 8 B-52s were shot down, 4 crashing on the spot, inflicting unprecedented losses on U.S. strategic air power. This was regarded as a decisive knockout blow, collapsing Washington's will to continue the campaign. After December 26th, Linebacker 2 essentially lost its ability to achieve its original strategic objectives. Excessive B-52 losses, symbol of U.S. military power, forced the Nixon administration to acknowledge failure and consider ending the bombing, paving the way for a return to the Paris negotiations. The aerial showdown over Hanoi entered its final phase, with victory decisively tilting toward Vietnam. The U.S. B-52 strategic bombing campaign of late 1972 was not only a fierce aerial military confrontation, but also left devastating humanitarian consequences for North Vietnamese civilians, particularly in Hanoi. Despite claims of military targets, bombs fell on densely populated neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, and civilian infrastructure, constituting undeniable war crimes. Most emblematic and tragic was the catastrophe on Com Thien Street. In one night, the entire area was flattened. Hundreds of families were buried under rubble. Multiple generations lost their lives simultaneously. Peaceful homes became bomb craters. Familiar streets turned into wastelands. Com Thien became a symbol of civilian suffering under U.S. aerial warfare. Statistics show that 2,068 civilians were killed, and more than 5,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged. Many hospitals and schools were hit, places that should have been protected under international law. These figures reflect not only material devastation, but the immense human cost borne by innocent civilians. Behind the cold statistics lie countless family tragedies: children losing parents, parents losing children, entire families wiped out overnight. Many children became orphans, growing up with memories of bombs, fire, and nights spent in shelters. Such suffering cannot be measured materially nor erased by time. In the long term, B-52 bombings inflicted deep psychological and social wounds, forming a collective memory of a brutal era in which civilians became direct victims of modern warfare. These crimes fueled global opposition and stand as irrefutable historical evidence of the inhumane nature of U.S. aerial warfare against Vietnam. Alongside air defense missile forces, the role of the Vietnam People's Air Force during the 12 days and nights of late 1972 held special military and spiritual significance. Despite confronting vastly superior U.S. air power, Vietnamese pilots demonstrated extraordinary courage, intelligence, and resolve, directly contributing to victory over Hanoi's skies. Most notable was the achievement of pilot Pham Tuan. Under extremely harsh combat conditions, amid dense jamming and multi-layered B-52 defenses, he piloted a MiG-21 to engage and shoot down a B-52. This marked the first time in world air combat history that a light fighter destroyed a B-52, the symbol of U.S. strategic air power. The victory carried immense military and psychological significance, proving that the invulnerable flying fortress could indeed be defeated. Equally emblematic was the heroic sacrifice of pilot Vu Xuan Tio. When his aircraft was severely damaged and unable to fire missiles, he chose to ram his plane into a B-52, destroying the target at the cost of his own life. His act embodied the spirit of sacrificing oneself for the survival of the nation, and symbolized the indomitable will of the Vietnamese people in unequal struggle. These feats and sacrifices, closely coordinated with missiles and anti-aircraft artillery, formed a multi-layered air defense posture that forced U.S. air power into a defensive position. More importantly, they shattered America's technological arrogance and elevated the fighting spirit of the entire nation. Thus, the role of Vietnam's Air Force is measured not only by enemy aircraft shot down, but by its immense spiritual value, an inseparable part of the victory known as Hanoi Dien Bien Phu in the air. After 12 days and nights of intense bombardment that failed to achieve strategic objectives, on the night of December 29, 1972, President Richard Nixon was forced to order the cessation of bombing over North Vietnam, officially ending Linebacker 2. This decision did not stem from goodwill, but from the severe losses suffered by U.S. air power, particularly B-52 forces, the backbone of America's strategic deterrence. Post-war data indicate that the U.S. lost a total of 81 modern aircraft, including 34 B-52s, along with numerous tactical planes. Dozens of pilots were shot down, some captured as prisoners. This represented an unprecedented level of loss for U.S. air campaigns since World War II and far exceeded Pentagon projections. Notably, Nixon later admitted in his memoirs that his greatest concern was not diplomatic pressure, but the continued loss of B-52s. The aircraft symbolized not only military capability, but America's global prestige during the Cold War. Their repeated destruction over Hanoi seriously undermined confidence in U.S. technological superiority and strategic air doctrine. The outcome of Linebacker 2 revealed a bitter truth. Overwhelming military power cannot crush the will of a nation determined to fight for independence. This failure forced the U.S. back to the Paris negotiating table from a position of weakness and marked the collapse of the strategy of coercing Vietnam through bombing. Linebacker 2 thus became a historical milestone exposing the ultimate limits of military power. Dien Phu in the air in late December 1972 stands as a brilliant milestone in Vietnam's history of resistance against foreign aggression. Following the crushing failure of Linebacker 2, the U.S. was compelled to halt bombing and return to the Paris talks in a weakened position, leading to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords on January 27, 1973. This decisive victory forced the U.S. to recognize Vietnam's independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and to withdraw all combat troops from the South. Historically, the victory not only shattered the myth of the invincible B-52, but also destroyed the strategy of imposing political will through technological and military superiority. For the first time in modern warfare, a small, resource-constrained nation defeated the world's most powerful strategic air assault, profoundly impacting global opinion and reshaping perceptions of power in war. The causes of victory lay foremost in President Ho Chi Minh's correct strategic foresight, predicting that the U.S. would only concede after defeat over Hanoi's skies. Equally vital was the party's wise, flexible, and steadfast leadership, integrating military and political objectives. Above all, the victory emerged from the harmonious combination of modern military science with human will, and from the heroic, resilient spirit of Vietnam's military and people. This combined strength forged the historic triumph of Hanoi, Dien Bien Phu in the air. The victory of Dien Bien Phu in the air resonated far beyond Vietnam, profoundly impacting international opinion, especially movements for peace, national independence, and opposition to neo-colonialism. Many countries, organizations, and progressive figures worldwide viewed it as compelling proof of the power of a small but resilient nation capable of confronting and defeating a leading military superpower. Among notable assessments, Cuban leader Fidel Castro's statement held special significance. The victory of the Vietnamese people is one of the greatest feats in human history. His words expressed admiration for Vietnam's intellect and courage, while affirming the universal value of the victory, the triumph of justice over violence, of human will over brute material force. Internationally, the victory inspired many nations struggling for independence in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, while prompting major powers to reassess the limits of technological dominance in modern warfare. Thus, Dien Bien Phu in the air stands not only as Vietnam's victory, but as a shared symbol of humanity's enduring aspiration, freedom, and peace.